In that room filled with smoke and cold stares, an ordinary player seemed invisible, with no strong cards or chips that mattered. Underestimated by the veterans, he was treated as easy prey. But a firm look changed everything, and that night would never be forgotten. Want to find out the outcome? Then like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. At first, he seemed like a fish out of water. His breathing was irregular, as if his heart had lost its rhythm under the weight of the table. His hands, though trying to remain steady, couldn't hide the sweat trickling between his fingers. His gaze, lost among chips and cards, revealed the insecurity of someone who carries on his shoulders not only the risk of failure, but also the silent judgment of everyone around him. This is how life often places us before an audience ready to laugh at any slip-up. Perhaps you felt this in a work meeting, when every word seems too heavy, or in a college presentation, when the eyes around you seem sharper than your own. Preparation. The thing is, in that scenario, the pressure wasn't just psychological. His every gesture became fuel for the veterans to label him as just another one who couldn't handle the first fall. His rivals sensed his fragility like predators smelling blood. They looked at each other with disdainful expressions, chuckled softly, and prepared to eliminate him like someone discarding a useless card. No word was needed. The suppressed laughter, the sidelong glances, and even the silence between them acted like invisible daggers. In that closed circle, he was just a passing extra, someone destined to leave before the game really began. But there's a curious detail. When everyone decides, you're weak, sometimes that's when the chance to surprise arises. This is a powerful paradox. Imagine, for example, an investor whom everyone underestimates because he starts small. He silently learns, observes, and waits. While the veterans boast of their past achievements, the supposed rookie absorbs enough to make an unexpected leap. The same applied to the player that night. The rival's contempt was the first fuel for a comeback no one suspected. The emotional impact, however, was devastating. The weight of the judgment nearly paralyzed him. It was as if every heartbeat screamed louder than the applause that never came. The feeling was of being crushed by negative expectations, of carrying the sentence of defeat on one's shoulders before the game even started. But within this chaos, something was beginning to change. Fear, when pushed to its limit, can transform into a spark of resilience. Anyone who has faced pressure knows there's a point at which the body trembles, but the mind decides not to give in. This is the spark that separates those who sink from those who rise. He felt this spark ignite, still weak, but enough to think, if they don't believe in me, maybe that's my advantage. And it was precisely this contradiction between fear and courage that paved the way for the first play that would change the course of that night. The moment arrived almost like an accident of fate, one of those moments that seem to form on their own when no one believes in you. He had nothing of consequence in his hands, weak cards, meager chips, and a confidence that was still struggling not to crumble under the scornful glances. But that's precisely where comebacks are born. Not when we have the perfect weapons, but when we're forced to use only our minds and courage. He took a deep breath, adjusted his posture, and stared at the table with a look that seemed to deny reality itself. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Every veteran, accustomed to crushing newcomers, couldn't imagine that a player at a disadvantage would dare act like that. So without hesitation, he made his bet. It wasn't just a move, it was a calculated bluff, a leap in the dark. The unexpected happened. The simple act of pushing his chips to the center changed the air in the room. as if a spark had ignited the dry ground that was the contempt of others. The opponents looked at each other, disconcerted. It made no sense that someone in that position would have the audacity to risk everything. One of the veterans cleared his throat, trying to disguise the tension. Another frowned, searching the newcomer's face for any sign of hesitation. But what they found was only a firm, almost defiant look that seemed to silently shout, "You don't know me!" And that was enough to unsettle even the coldest of them. What had been restrained laughter now turned to caution. It wasn't just about the cards, it was about presence, about energy, about the ability to hold a look that said more than any play. The surrounding audience began to lean forward, curious, as if sensing something extraordinary was about to happen. It's interesting how, in real life, the same thing happens. An intern who decides to present an idea in front of directors, a discredited athlete who dares to risk an unlikely move, a novice investor who bets on something everyone else has rejected. These moments, even though they seem crazy, change narratives. And in that instant, the narrative at the table shifted. Contempt gave way to discomfort. The newcomer was no longer an irrelevant detail, but a variable the veterans couldn't calculate. Their confidence, built over years of experience, began to show cracks. After all, how could you face someone who, even with nothing in hand, maintains their posture as if they had the whole world on their side? This is the power of bluffing, not just in gambling, but in any area of life. Think of a job interview. For example, how many times do you not know all the answers but maintain your calm, your tone of voice firm, and your gaze fixed? It is in this psychological game that the outcome is determined. The player that night understood, albeit intuitively, that more than the cards, it was his gaze that was at stake. And it was this realization that disconcerted the veterans, forcing them to recalculate their strategies. While the others hesitated, he felt something awaken within him. It was as if, in that moment, he had discovered that his initial weakness was not a burden, but a mask that deceived everyone. The bold bluff was not just a play, it was a silent declaration that he was not there to be a sidekick. His heart, still racing, now beat a different rhythm, not of fear, but of excitement. With each passing second, the room sank deeper into suspense. The audience, his opponents, and even he himself realized that the match had changed hands. The veterans, once so confident, now looked to each other for support, but found none. He alone bore the weight of that turnaround with something seemingly simple, a look no one could decipher. This is the essence of comebacks. It's not the strength of the cards, but the courage to take a risk when no one expects anything of you. And so, the first bold move not only changed the course of the match, but also lit a spark that would grow with each round. The audience no longer saw an insecure rookie, but a player who possessed something that couldn't be taught in strategy books: the courage to face the improbable. The bluff was a turning point, a milestone that put everyone on alert. It wasn't just about winning or losing chips in that round, but about challenging an established order that, until then, seemed unshakable. The curious thing is that this type of situation repeats itself in our lives in different forms. It could be the student who surprises the entire class with an unexpected answer, the employee who presents a creative solution that changes a project, or even someone who, in a simple act of courage, transforms everyone's perception of them. The player proved that often, a single bold move is enough to change an entire story. With each round that progressed, something in him changed. He was no longer the same player who had entered hesitantly, carrying the weight of fear in his hands. The sweat that had previously betrayed his insecurity now dried, replaced by an erect, firm, almost defiant posture. His breathing, previously irregular, had found a cadence. And, even more surprising, his gaze no longer strayed. It held, stared, dominated. It was as if each partial victory, however small, was living proof that he had more than just cards in play. He had the courage to face, chip after chip, the psychological weight of those who had never believed in him. The veterans, accustomed to running the table with coolness, began to realize that the shadow they had underestimated was becoming an uncomfortable presence. The atmosphere changed. Where once there had been easy laughter, now hovered a calculated silence. This contrast between experience and boldness became increasingly evident. The veterans, carrying years of practice and consolidated strategies, played as if reciting a rehearsed script. He, with nothing to lose, acted like someone improvising in a play where no one knows the next act. And it is precisely improvisation that is disconcerting, because it breaks patterns. Think of a chess match. The master follows classic lines, tested moves, while the novice, unaware of the theoretical limitations, dares to move pieces in unusual ways. This kind of boldness, even if risky, sometimes surprises and breaks the logic of the more experienced player. That's how it was at that table. The novice didn't follow the expected rhythm. He dictated a new beat, sustained not by the cards, but by the psychological reading of his opponent's gestures, looks, and silences. Each play became a spectacle of courage. He didn't need the best cards to win. He just needed confidence in his own vision. And this, little by little, was noticed even by the audience watching. Those watching from the outside began to cheer, like those following a narrative in which the underdog gains momentum and threatens the big names. This also happens in sports. Remember when a small team faces a powerhouse and, against all odds, scores the first goal. The fans cheer not only for the play, but for the break with logic, for the audacity to challenge the impossible. In that smoke-filled hall, the same feeling spread. The beginner everyone believed would be eliminated right from the start was now the protagonist of a story that captivated eyes, hearts, and breaths. The most interesting thing was how each partial victory represented not only accumulated chips, but also earned respect. With each round won, the veteran's silence grew heavier, almost an involuntary acknowledgement that this player was no longer a passing shadow. His confidence grew not only because he accumulated results, but because he understood, deep down, that he had already broken the most difficult barrier, the barrier of contempt. Once the eyes of his rivals no longer saw him as easy prey, everything changed. And this applies to any area of life. When someone stops being seen as invisible and starts to be recognized, albeit reluctantly, the game has already changed. It's like the employee who, after months of being ignored, gains traction with an innovative idea, or the discredited student who, by excelling in a project, begins to be listened to even by the strictest professors. The rise of the competition was essentially an internal climb. What truly changed wasn't just the chips on the table, but his self-perception. He understood that he didn't need perfect cards to move forward. He just needed to believe that his perspective was stronger than the doubts of others. And this, curiously, is a lesson many forget. How often do we stop trying because we convince ourselves we don't have the right cards? The reality is that life doesn't hand out perfect hands. The secret lies in playing well with what you have, in maintaining confidence even in the face of the improbable. And there, at that tense table, this man embodied exactly that, living proof that boldness can be more powerful than any cold strategy. As the rounds passed, the energy at the table shifted almost palpably. What had once been absolute dominance among veterans was beginning to crumble in the face of a player who refused to be predictable. What had once been coolness now became caution, and what had once been easy laughter turned into narrowed eyes, attentive to his every move. The entire room no longer witnessed just a card battle, but a duel of postures. The contrast was clear. On one side, tradition, the confidence of someone who believed they had seen it all. On the other, boldness, the fresh courage of someone with nothing to lose. This climb wasn't just a succession of victories. It was a process of transformation, almost a rite of passage. He was no longer the same player who had entered the game insecure. Now he was someone who inspired the audience and provoked in his rivals the discomfort of recognizing they were facing something they could not control. As the night wore on, his presence at the table was no longer possible to ignore. If before, it had been merely a detail overlooked among veterans, now it had become a silent threat. And it was precisely at this moment that one of the more experienced players decided to intervene. He couldn't bear to see his dominance challenged by someone who, in theory, had no right to be there. With a cold gaze, an imposing posture, and a seemingly unshakable stack of chips, this rival stood as a direct obstacle, almost a guardian of the veteran's prestige. His first actions weren't even with cards, but with words, subtle provocations, phrases laden with irony, trying to undermine the newbie's newly emerging confidence. "Bluffing again, kid?" he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. And this kind of psychological attack is often more destructive than any play. The clash wasn't just technical, it was mental. With each round, the experienced rival launched hidden challenges, looks that sought to pierce his opponent's composure, and gestures that seemed more like invisible traps. He crossed his arms strategically, shook his chips as if he owned time, and took deep breaths at crucial moments to destabilize the atmosphere. Everything was calculated. This psychological battle resembled a Cold War. Neither was actually firing, but both knew that any hesitation would be fatal. And in real life, how often do we face rivals like this? That person at work who, more than competing, tries to destabilize with sarcastic comments. Or a colleague who, instead of acknowledging your progress, constantly reminds you of your past mistakes. These are the duels that take place off the cards, but which demand the same strength of emotional resilience. As the atmosphere at the table grew increasingly tense, the competition was no longer just about chips and partial victories. It became a true duel of wills. The room, once noisy, now seemed to witness an invisible struggle between two worlds. On one side, tradition laden with experience, accustomed to winning through the weight of intimidation. On the other, the budding boldness of someone who discovered that confidence doesn't need permission to exist. The audience felt this shock, leaning forward, holding their breath, as if following a narrative that goes beyond the game and touches something deeper. It was clear that, from then on, nothing would be easy. Every bet, every silence, every provocation became a chapter in a larger conflict. It wasn't just about who would take the chips, but about who would withstand the invisible weight of pressure and assert themselves as the master of the table. He was no longer the same man who had hesitantly entered that room. The cold sweat had given way to a serene expression, and his previously trembling hands now moved with almost choreographed precision. Each gesture seemed calculated, yet natural, as if he had trained his entire life for this moment. The most striking thing, however, was not the chips he was beginning to accumulate, but the invisible weight in his gaze. It wasn't a look of explicit defiance nor of arrogance, but a profound silence charged with confidence. Those observing from the outside sensed that, even without relevant cards, he held his own as if he had the perfect hand. And that, in itself, was devastating. After all, in gambling, and in life, sometimes the most powerful thing isn't what's revealed, but what remains hidden. The clashes intensified, and now every silence was worth more than any word. An arched eyebrow, a suppressed sigh, or even the way he shuffled his chips were signs that confused and disarmed the veterans. The more imposing rival, the one he'd previously reveled in scorning, no longer displayed the same confidence. It was as if he'd realized he was facing someone who played not just with cards, but with unshakable conviction. The entire room felt this shift, as if the energy had changed hands. It's curious how this also applies to everyday life. How often is a simple silence in a discussion worth more than a barrage of arguments? Or how, in difficult negotiations, can one side's unshakable calm completely disarm the other? This was the duel taking place there, not of cards, but of minds. And little by little, everyone at the table, and beyond, realized that his presence was no coincidence. He was prepared for that moment. Perhaps he hadn't rehearsed every move. Perhaps he didn't possess the detailed theory that veterans possessed. But there was something in his posture that couldn't be taught. The courage to hold his gaze, even when all seemed lost. This revelation transformed the atmosphere into something almost mythical, as if the poker table were a stage where not just a game, but a universal truth was being played out. From that point on, each confrontation took on a new weight. The audience was no longer witnessing an ordinary contest, but a spectacle of courage versus intimidation, of authenticity versus the force of status. It was inevitable. The next step could only lead to an even greater climax, a climax that everyone sensed, but no one could foresee. Silence filled the room. It was as if even the smoke in the air had stopped, suspended, awaiting the outcome. The final duel had arrived. He, the discredited rookie, against his most feared rival, the same one who had spent the entire night trying to crush his confidence. The chips were pushed to the center of the table, and in that gesture, there was more than money. There was the symbolic weight of a battle of wills. The veteran, experienced and accustomed to easy victories, held a hard, menacing gaze. But on the other side, the beginner returned it with serenity, as if each second of tension were just another step toward the inevitable. The atmosphere was stifling. The audience around him didn't dare breathe loudly. Every movement seemed to drag on for minutes. The veteran waited for a sign of weakness, a look away, a trembling hand, a hurried breath. But what he found was only firmness. And in that moment, it became clear that this was no longer a game of cards. It didn't matter if he had a strong hand or a complete bluff. What was at stake was the ability to sustain one's conviction. This is a scene everyone has experienced in some way. The job interview where you don't have all the answers, but you hold your gaze firmly. The difficult conversation where, even without perfect arguments, you don't waver. The moment when silence, more than any word, decides the outcome. The veteran hesitated. His fingers, which had previously been tapping rhythmically on the table, now stopped. The audience noticed. The entire room noticed. The beginner didn't need to turn over cards. His look had already turned the tide. His rival backed away as if finally recognizing that he wasn't facing just a novice, but someone with the courage to defy all logic. When the last chip was pulled toward the beginner, the room erupted, not in screams, but in a heavy silence of respect. In that instant, he stopped being just a player. He became a legend. Victory came not just with the sound of chips being pulled his way, but with something greater, the silent recognition of all who had underestimated him. There were no shouts, no rehearsed applause, just different looks. The same audience that had regarded him with disdain now bowed, almost reverently, before the unexpected. The table had not been won by cards, but by poise, courage, and the audacity to hold a gaze when everything pointed to defeat. This symbolized more than a result. It was proof that, at certain moments, the mind is sharper than any deck of cards. The respect earned was immediate. The veteran who had previously challenged him at every turn now retreated into silence, not out of fear, but out of the natural justice that hung over the scene. It was impossible not to admit. The invisible player had imposed a lesson that would not soon fade, and it was not just a victory over others, but over himself, against fear, doubt, judgment, and disbelief. This is true justice. When one who seemed destined for failure rises and shows that the impossible can be overcome by the force of courage. And deep down, everyone in the room knew they were not just witnessing the end of a match, but the birth of a legend who would transform the way they viewed the game itself. When the room finally began to breathe again, the player realized that his greatest achievement lay not in the chips piled up before him, but in what had changed within himself. His initial fear already seemed like a distant memory, as if it belonged to someone else. He understood, then and there, that life isn't about what we hold in our hands, but how we hold our gaze in the face of the improbable. And this lesson, silent and profound, echoed in every corner of the room. The audience saw not just a winner, but a man who dared to transform weakness into strength, doubt into courage, disbelief into respect. As he rose from the table, it was clear that the night wouldn't end there. His story would continue to be told, not by the number of chips or the cards that never came, but by the courage to face himself when everyone expected his downfall. Ultimately, poker was just a metaphor. Just like life, it's not just about the cards you're dealt, but about the confidence in how you play each moment. And that night, in front of so many eyes, he proved that a simple look can change the entire fate of a game and, who knows, a life.